Hello. Today I will be speaking about the nationalism of the French Revolution of 1789. I'll start off by explaining what nationalism is as an ideology. Then I will give a brief explanation of the French Revolution. And then I will give my thoughts on nationalism. So, what is nationalism? Nationalism is essentially the ideology which posits that a nation, that is a group of people which can be defined by cultural or linguistic or historical characteristics which are commonly shared in that group of people, that nation has a right to independence and has a right to preserve its culture. And the best way to do that, to conduct that preservation of culture, is through national sovereignty, to give sovereignty over laws and the execution of laws to the leaders of that nation, or to the nation itself, and then that sovereignty will be carried out by the leaders of the nation. What are some examples of nationalist movements? Well, we have nationalists in the United Kingdom. The Scottish National Party, which wants to give, which is so nationalist about about the Scottish nation, and indeed Scotland is a nation. It's very, very nationalist, and it wants Scotland to be independent of the United Kingdom, to have sovereignty over itself instead of having sovereignty being held by the United Kingdom as a whole, which includes Scotland. And also in the United Kingdom we have Irish Republicans, Sinn Féin, who in the past were definitely associated with a very vicious Irish nationalist group, the Irish Republican Army, which were very, very extreme in their Irish nationalism, that all of Ireland should be one sovereign nation. And obviously this was in a deliberate act of ignorance towards the diversity of Northern Ireland, because indeed Northern Ireland is diverse, and that's why it wasn't part of the Republic of Ireland, so-called Republic of Ireland, because indeed it does not represent all of Ireland, but that's why it wasn't given to Southern Ireland. Indeed, what we call the Republic of Ireland should be called Southern Ireland, because it doesn't represent all of the island of Ireland because of Northern Ireland. But anyway, they were so nationalist in their beliefs that they decided to start murdering members of the royal family, murdering British politicians, murdering their own countrymen in Northern Ireland. Just a bloodbath caused by nationalism. You could also say that the American Revolution was a nationalist event. And unfortunately, His Majesty has had to go and celebrate the 250th anniversary of that revolution, which was indeed against the United Kingdom. It's very, very unfortunate that I don't understand why we have to do that, but anyway. You can already tell that I feel very, very strong about nationalism, but anyway, I'll get to that. There could also be nationalism, for example, Basque nationalism. There are Basque separatist movements in Spain and France. But anyway, that's nationalism, the belief that a nation which is defined by by a group of people sharing the same cultural, linguistic, historical characteristics on usually one piece of territory, usually, and that nation should have sovereignty. Now let's get to the French Revolution. Now the French Revolution was, this was just an event which completely shook Europe. Completely shook Europe and the world. Although we can also blame the Americans for this, but that's another issue. So the French Revolution of 1789 was a reaction to the systems in place in France up to that point. Now, France was divided into 3 estates under the king. It wasn't that the king was a member of one of the estates. Some people sometimes think that. These were 3 estates under the king. The first estate was the clergy. The second estate was the nobility, the aristocracy. And the third estate was everyone else. And of course there were internal divisions within each estate anyway, because not all priests are rich or powerful, and there were even poor aristocrats, very, very poor aristocrats, who were poorer than the richest members of the Third Estate, which was supposed to be the common people, the most oppressed people in France. They were the most oppressed people in France, that is a fact. So there was a lot of diversity. Often when people think about the French Revolution, they think that there were really only 3 modes of existence, plus the king. But no, there was a lot of diversity, but people were divided among First, Second, Third Estate. In the grand scheme of things, it didn't really matter whether you were a poor aristocrat or a rich aristocrat, because you would have more favourable treatment. The government would treat you in a more favourable way than it would treat the peasant who was, or not a peasant, the bourgeois member of the Third Estate who was richer than you. So this system was part of the Ancien Régime, which I think would mean old order or old regime. And that was the ancient system of France. As long as there was a France, which can be traced back approximately to the establishment of West Francia as a distinct entity, free from more pan-Frankish identity, and it was based in what we would call France, and it developed into France distinct from the other Frankish territories, like Germany, for example. That was the ancient system of France. And yes, it was very, very oppressive for the Third Estate, which were the only ones who were taxed, and they were taxed in a very horrendous way, while the First and Second Estates, who were making the most money. I did say about poor aristocrats, but really the First and Second Estates, they owned most of the land in France, they had most of the wealth. There were exceptions in the third estate, but if one was to look at all of France in a sort of synthesized manner, you would see that, yes, basically the first and second estate were the most powerful and richest groups in the country. Now, up to 1789, there were lots of disputes between the third estate and the other two estates. Excuse me. And I'm not going to bore people with the details, but basically, all three estates had been summoned by the king, King Louis XVI, to meet together in the estates in what was called the Estates General. And the Estates General was comprised of the representatives of all of those three estates. But there were disputes over how decisions would be made, and there were disputes about other things as well. And eventually, the third estate simply left. The representatives of the third estate left, and they went to another part of Paris. Excuse me, not in Paris. It was in Versailles, which was the main administrative centre of France. They went to another building in that general area, which was the tennis court, and they took an oath, the tennis court oath, which established what they called the National Assembly, and they decided that the National Assembly would not dissolve until a constitution had been written, until a new constitution had been written for France, and it would be a more so-called liberal constitution for France. However, they were in fact constitutional monarchists. At this point, French revolutionaries were constitutional monarchists. That's not something that most people know, but in fact, the French revolutionaries didn't start out wanting to decapitate Louis XVI's head. They didn't want to decapitate his body, him. And so the important thing to note here, because we're talking about the nationalism of the French Revolution, the important thing to note is this tennis court oath. Because in the tennis court oath, as I said, they created the National Assembly. Now, what does that mean? It's the assembly of the representatives of the nation. It is the representatives of the nation assembled together. Now, you may be rightly asking yourself, well, there weren't any members of the second or first estate there, or the king, whom they were actually supporting, because they were constitutional monarchists. And that's my whole point, really. They decided that the third estate was its own nation. They became third estate nationalists. And the National Assembly really was the third estate assembly. There were no representatives of the second estate or the first estate or the king assembled in the tennis court. There were none. So essentially, you have this nationalist exercise. And I always used to think, wrongly, that no, the French Revolution was not a nationalist revolution, it was a liberal revolution. Because the native people of France were already independent. I mean, France as a nation, which it is, the third estate are wrong. The representatives of the third estate were wrong. France as a whole as a nation, not just the third estate. So the nation of France is independent. It is sovereign, depending on how one even defines that, but it is sovereign, in my opinion, the French nation. So I always used to think that it wasn't a nationalist revolution, but actually it was, because if you look at it, the National Assembly, the creation of the National Assembly in the tennis court, was a nationalist exercise. They were third estate nationalists. And France has never truly recovered from this selective nationalism. And excuse me, it has really affected France in a negative way. And so yes, that's basically my theory, that the French Revolution was indeed a nationalist exercise. Now, my third thing that I said that I was going to talk about was nationalism, my thoughts on nationalism. I don't agree with nationalism. I am an anti-nationalist. What I agree with is sovereignty. That there is a legal system of sovereignty which can clearly be demonstrated, I disagree with nationalism because I don't think it works. If we were to give every nation its own sovereign state, the world would immediately go into chaos. You wouldn't have any sort of stability, geopolitical stability, because suddenly geopolitics would be run by nationalist theories. I mean, look at the major wars that are either happening in the 21st century or are about to happen. These three major wars being Russia and Ukraine, the State of Israel versus Palestine, and mainland China against Taiwan. So, and each of these are nationalist wars, by the way. They are all nationalist wars. So, Russia, Ukraine, it's really a nationalist exercise for Russia, and it's a sovereigntist exercise for Ukraine. Because Russia claims that parts of Ukraine or all of Ukraine are part of the Russian nation, probably even Belarus is part of the Russian nation. And if it was democratic, Belarus would be at war with Russia too, but it's not. So Russia has decided to go in and, in a nationalist exercise, capture these so-called Russian areas. Then the State of Israel versus Palestine. The State of Israel is itself a nationalist exercise, a Jewish nationalist exercise, and Jewish nationalism is Zionism, and I'll be discussing Zionism tomorrow. Because I have more complicated thoughts on Zionism. And this Zionist Israeli government is engaged in war against Palestinian nationalist groups, including Hamas, which viciously started this war. This particular war, the war in Gaza, was completely started by Hamas. And then China, mainland China versus Taiwan. The Chinese Communist Party, which is illegitimate, by the way, and I'll be discussing that another time as well. The government is illegitimate. But the CCP claims that Taiwan is part of the Chinese nation, which may be true. But that is the motivation for the CCP's ambitions regarding Taiwan. Now, I'm against that. I would completely support the Taiwanese people in that conflict. And I think that the government in Taipei, on the island of Taiwan, is the legitimate government of all of China. And I will discuss that another time as well, when I discuss the illegitimacy of the communist government in China. So you can see that the three major wars are nationalist endeavours. The offending party in all of the major wars are nationalists. And so this is the instability, the disorder that nationalism produces. Now, I'm not someone who doesn't believe in nations. I believe in strong nations. I believe in a strong English nation, but I don't think that there should be a strong English sovereign state. I believe in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which is a sovereign state. I believe in the United States, a sovereign entity. France, the French Republic, a sovereign entity. I don't support nationalism. And I don't think that nationalism is even that productive either. I think that everyone in the world should have a vote, should be able to exercise some level of determination of what happens in their territory. But I don't think that there should be nationalism. I don't think that there should be a one world government. I think that the world is benefited from multiple sovereign states. I think that is a better organisation of humanity than a one world government. So yes, those are my views on nationalism, and I've also discussed the French Revolution of 1789 and how it was a nationalist revolution, and I discussed nationalism as a whole. Thank you for listening. Have a blessed day.